Hi, guys. Welcome back to Infinite Possibilities, the podcast where we explore the lives of amazing people, their choices, challenges, and opportunities. And today I have a very special guest, Pia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. So, Pia, what's your 2-minute introduction about what you do?
I work in the middle ground between technology, society, and the public service in particular, really trying to actually create a more equitable, inclusive, and participatory approach to governance so that we can have a more equitable, inclusive society. So it's basically just being a professional geek for the power of good, hopefully.
That sounds good. So we're going to backtrack. We're going to see what kind of childhood Pia had and how she really got to who she is today. So, Pia, what kind of child were you like growing up?
So I was a bit of a troublemaker, to be honest. My mum would describe me in one word as precocious for many years. I used to be very proud because I thought it meant ferocious. And then when I learned what it meant, when I got into the double digits, I got a little bit less impressed with that title. But a bit of a rule breaker. If there was a rule, I'd like to figure out a way around it. Quite independent. So my mum's a techie and my dad's a salesman. So I sort of picked up a bit of both skills, but they're also both very focused on fairness and equity and community. And I think I've picked up on that as well. I think the final piece to understanding my childhood is I started martial arts when I was 11. And I've done martial arts ever since. Learning about and shaping my approach to life, my worldview, and some of my skill sets, not just obviously physically, but psychologically. That's been a big part of my life as well.
Yeah, that's so cool. And when you say you were a troublemaker, if I were to see you as a child, what would I be seeing? Were you like jumping off fences? Were you, I don't know, hyperactive or?
When I spent 2 years at boarding school for 11 and 12, and I have a couple of good friends from then who we made it an agreement between us to take the full list of rules of the boarding school that we were at, which was a Catholic school, and be able to tick them off and break them all at least once before the end of year 12. So that's the kind of kid.
Wow. So I guess you weren't really a good student per se at school?
I was a really great student up until year 10. I've always had a pretty reasonable intelligence, but being a kid from a small country town, you end up either hiding it or that being a problem. So I sort of did a bit of both. I hid it by doing lots and lots of sports, but I used to come in the top 1% or top of the state for maths and science kind of competitions, and would always shrug them off and say, yeah, okay, whatever, let's go do some swimming or pool or whatever. I was a pretty intelligent kid and I loved learning, but year 11 and 12 going off to boarding school was not good for my concentration. I thought, I'll go to boarding school and I'll be able to really focus on studies. But no, as it turns out, living in a room with, what became then best friends was just a 100% distraction. So
Yeah, that's cool. And so when you say that you really had to sort of like hide your intelligence, why is that? Is it specifically because you're a country kid, or I think like in high school, primary school, it's in general not that cool to be like a geek or be like a nerd. So why was that?
yeah, I think that's changed a little bit today. But I think, looking back, I mean, I'm 42 now, so it's a while ago now, but I think when I was a kid, being female and smart possibly might have been part of it, but small country town can and a Catholic school is not, it's not as ambitious as either the public schools or the private schools. So Catholic schools is kind of this weird third way. So I think it's just a little bit of kids can be pretty cruel to each other, and so you've got to figure out which box you want to be put in. And in primary school, it was a really I struggled a bit in primary school, to be honest, because I'm a bit of a pleaser. But when I started martial arts and had this whole world outside of school, I had something to balance me. And I sort of came back to high school just not really caring so much about making my place. And I discovered this weird box I could put myself in, which was kind of the alternative box. Suddenly I was, the kid that did martial arts and played guitar, and I and a girl who knew about tech. But when I was at school, there was only me and one other kid that was into computers. So we had exactly a 50-50 male female proportion. So like I didn't have any of that kind of, being a female in IT in a Western country. Of course, being a female in IT in a Eastern or Middle Eastern country, you're a majority, but in Australia it was a minority at that point. But I didn't experience any of that till I got into the workplace. So so I think it's more just a kid thing. If you're too much of a smart aleck, then that's a reason to be different. So everyone just tries to blend with each other, I think.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. And so I guess what kind of made your parents enroll you in martial arts? And was it love at first sight?
Oh, my parents didn't enroll me in anything. I enrolled myself.
Oh, wow, that kind of kid.
Yeah. There was a karate school, karate school, opened up in my little town. And so I went along to that when I was 11. And I trained in that for 2 years and I loved it. And I got up to sort of well, maybe 3 years. I got up to sort of a brown belt, 2 stripes, almost a black belt.
Wow.
And but then this guy came to do a demonstration of Shaolin Kung Fu at my school, Shaolin Kung Fu, as we call it. And I saw this art and I'm like, that's what I want to study. So he normally only took 16-year-olds and I was only 14 at the time, but he accepted me into the school. So I was the youngest by far of this mostly adult school of Shaolin Kung Fu. And Shaolin just spoke to me. Like everyone has a different proclivity for a different martial art. I believe like there's a martial art there for everyone. And Shaolin Kung Fu is associated with Chan Buddhism, which is kind of the mum of Zen Buddhism. And that as a philosophical approach to life really spoke to me as well. So it's been my comfortable place. And well, it's actually a very uncomfortable place because there's so much about self-evolution and self-development in that whole, discipline every day. But yeah, so I enrolled in myself and it was when I started Shaolin Kung Fu that I completely, found one of my places. Probably the third part that shaped who I am today, but it didn't happen when I was a kid, was of course getting into open source, which I did later when I was about 19. So those 3 parts of my life, my parents, my martial arts, and my and open source has probably shaped most of my profession and career.
Yeah, that's cool. And just wondering, were you like one of the only females doing martial arts, or at that time was it cool for girls to also do it?
I don't think I've ever defined myself by what's cool. Yeah. I do something because I like it.
Yeah.
And so, whether lots or no females, I always had female and male friends. Small country town, you tend to have more females and male friends. You don't have enough capacity to sort of branch off into only dealing with your own gender. So I never really experienced any of that really till I got to the city, to be honest. In fact, my mum was probably the most techie person in my town. So, she ended up coming and taking. So when I was in year 7, our IT teacher was a nice enough lady, but she was teaching out of a 5 or 10-year-old book at that point. And so and she was teaching Mac specific, Apple specific terminologies. And so I just kept interrupting. I'm like, no, that's not how it works. No, that's not. And so she finally was like, well, if you know so much, why don't you teach it? I'm like, okay. So I taught the class for like 2 weeks before she finally, because she thought I'd give up or find it too hard or whatever. So she finally admitted to the principal what happened, who then called my mum in. And then my mum was like, well, why were you teaching this, out of date stuff? And then my mum became the teacher. So it really backfired on me because I ended up with my mum as the bloody teacher.
Oh, wow, that's so funny. Like she was trying to get you in trouble, but then she got herself fired, pretty much.
No, not fired. She was taking other classes. IT was kind of her optional thing, but yeah. So yeah, that's kind of funny.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I'm trying to think like, how did you sort of have so much confidence as a child to do your own thing? Like a lot of the time, yeah, you're a very people pleaser kind of in that sort of vulnerable state when you're in primary school and high school. But, you enrolled yourself in martial arts, you taught a school. Do you know where it came from, or is it naturally?
I think believing in yourself is something, it's not a natural thing, it's something you learn. I think I get a lot of confidence from my parents. Like all 3 of us, my 2 siblings and I think are quite confident people. And my dad is a hyper confident person. So a bit of that's probably a bit of learned behavior.
Yeah.
But also, one thing I've noticed is that a lot of people, particularly the more empathetic and the more self-aware a person is, the more they feel nervous to put themselves out there and get it wrong. And I think that so many brilliant people I know, are a bit nervous to put themselves out there because of that. The way I've always thought about it is it's not about putting myself out there. It's about representing the knowledge or the discipline or the team, or when you sort of and this is one of the things that martial arts and particularly animal boxing kind of really did teach me. When you adopt the psychological toolkit you need for the circumstance, you're still being genuine to yourself, but you're just adopting some different cognitive tools, then you can be present in the moment in a way that's most useful to that moment. I told my parents I wanted a horse. Well, I asked my parents for a horse when I was 12, and they said, if you want one, you buy one. And so I went, my brother and I have, in particular, and my sister later on, always worked since we were kids, for money. And so I went and, saved up my money and I bought a horse. And in a small town, I could adjust a horse for $10 a week because that's achievable. I could buy a horse for $500, adjust it for $10 a week, get up before school, go up and ride my horse. My parents thought I was an alien because it's not like we had a farm or anything. I organized it all. And so I think it's just about realizing just how much more empowered you are than I think a lot of people realize. And I think in the country, you get a lot more of that freedom because, if you want something, you've got to go and do it. Whereas in the city, I think kids are constantly told, don't do this, don't stand there, don't, go out, don't. And I think that internalizes a certain sense of seeking permission rather than asking forgiveness. Whereas in the country, you absolutely ask forgiveness.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting.
Just a thought.
Yeah. But that's pretty cool. The asking for forgiveness rather than permission, just doing it and then dealing with the consequences later. Yeah. Oh, damn. And it sounds like your childhood was pretty fun, man. You bought a horse, you did. Did you do, so what about in terms of like other hobbies, like other than martial arts, did you, so how long did you keep that horse for, by the way? That's kind of crazy.
Yeah, from 13 till 17. So I went and did the first year in boarding school, and it was very clear I couldn't spend the time with my horse. And so he went to another loving home. And of course, this is a long time ago now, so he's probably passed away since then. So I think so. Computer games was obviously, well, not obviously, I was always into computer games. My mum and dad owned an electronics shop, so we weren't allowed computer consoles at home, like games consoles at home. So at home we had PCs, very early PCs, and so we'd play some PC games at home. But my brother and I, after school, would go down to mum and dad's store to play, the early consoles from back then, and play the Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt and all that kind of stuff. So we would do that after school. But also after school would work for my for their store, and it was it was good stuff. My dad would be like, if I he'd ask me to go and sweep the front, and I hate sweeping the front. So, but if I didn't do a good job, he'd say, if I can't trust you to do something so simple, how can I give you something more interesting? And I'm like, oh yeah, okay, fair enough. So lots of life lessons.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. And so when you were like in high school around that time, in terms of careers, what were you kind of leaning towards? Did you have anything? A vet. Oh, is that because you had a love for animals, right? Since you sort of had a horse.
Yeah. And always loved animals. So I wanted to be a vet, and I went and did my year 10 work experience at a veterinarian's in my little town. And it was so funny because even though I love animals, I don't particularly like blood. And so watching surgery on a dog with a knee reconstruction for a dog, helping a cow to give birth. Actually, that was a real moment because the as the calf came out, its little feet, little hooves and nose had been exposed to the elements for hours, and that had been pecked away by animals, and that was by birds, which was awful. So we were like, well, we're just going to save the life of the mother now. But when we pulled it out, it was alive. So, so I got to kind of, hang it upside down to let all the stuff come out of its lungs and just sort of pat it down. And that was, really cool, so we sort of saved the life of this little baby cow. But yeah, I just realized I didn't have the stomach for it. I realized it would destroy me because I'm a very empathetic person. So then I didn't know what to do. And leading, 11, 12, I saw IT and technology as this kind of just tools that you use for business, right? I didn't see it as a soulful path or a meaningful path at the time. And so I tried all these other things. And then I went, I'll just go and work. I even went to China doing Chinese medicine. So really, I was looking for truth. I went to do physics for a little while, but I discovered in physics a world where you have a hypothesis and you test it, and it may or may not be true, but truth is not hard and fast. So I could never find truth. And so I thought, I'll just go and work in IT for a little while I figure it out. And then I discovered open source, and I found this weird space where my skills, I've always been good at tech, where my skills intersected with my values. And then I had this like epiphany. I went to a United Nations conference when I was like 20, 21, 22 or something, on the tail of Linux Professional Institute. And and it was there that I had this moment of, I'm talking to people from all around the world. We don't speak the same language, but we all love Linux and open source. And I could see the impact of technology. So this is 20 years ago, the impact on technology in shaping people's lives, in shaping their opportunities and shaping their communications and relationships and communities. And I vowed at that point, and I felt a deep sense of responsibility at that point as a person who has technology skills and intuitions and such. I wanted to be a person who could use my skills to ensure that technology was used to make the world a better place, not a worse place. Because there will always be people that are happy to or unintentionally using those skills to make things worse. So I wanted to be part of the counter movement to that, to ensure that technology made things better.
Oh, damn, very noble cause. But I want to quickly backtrack. So when you said that you went to China and you went to study medicine and you tried physics, was this kind of like you took a gap year to try and figure out what you wanted to do? Or were you still like, where did that fit in?
So I finished school. Having finished school, and because my year 11 and 12 was just one big lack of study because of just hanging out with friends and just goofing off, I didn't have a huge amount of choices with the TER I ended up with, UAI or whatever they call it now. And so I actually went into nursing to start as my pathway into university. And within 3 months, I'm like, oh yeah, no, I could never be a nurse. These people are amazing. And I just don't have, again, the stomach for it. But that got me and then after nursing, I actually went into physics. I managed to talk my way into a physics department in Newcastle. And that was funny because I could see, I read the book Chaos, which just made me go, oh, this. So I went up to university in the physics department and said, I'd really like to join. He's like, oh, okay, well, and he took sort of an eraser and piled it on a CD and he made this little stack of stuff and then pushed on one of them. And he said, which forces are acting on this thing? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. Well, intuitively, you've got the friction of what's around it. You've got the force of gravity. You've got the force of, the weight of these things. And you've got, and he's like, okay, you're in. But again, a few months, 3 or 4 months into physics, and I just realized I realized it would take 10 years to get to the really good stuff, and I just wasn't that patient. So, I finished the half year there, and then I went into Chinese medicine, and I did the first half year, and then they had a exchange program. So I decided to do the second half year exchange program going to China. And I realized through doing the Chinese medicine that I was too ambitious, not in a personal sense, but in an impact sense. I was like, oh, great, because Chinese medicine is actually quite extraordinary. I was like, oh, well, I could use it to cure epilepsy or cure this or cure that. And I realized that if someone just came to my practice that just wanted help, I realized I'd be always looking for the big thing to solve. I realized I was too immature in myself to be like a really good healer. Like I was trying to solve the world's problems, not just be there for that person. Yeah. So I thought, okay, I'll go do something else and I'll come back to this in my 50s or 60s. I'll come back to this after I figure, after I do some other things. And it was at that point I was like, oh, I don't know what to do. I'll just go into IT and then I'll come back to this. And so I kept doing my studies and I was working in IT, but I didn't actually finish my degree. Oh. Fast forward 9 years, I'd been involved in the open source community in my spare time and working in the tech sector, and but doing a lot of advocacy around free trade agreements and open source and government. And the Shadow Minister of IT was giving a speech about a US-Australia free trade agreement. So I went along to heckle, and she gave a great speech, which exactly said what I was going to say. And I'm like, oh. So we got to talking, and that was Senator Kate Lundy, and came to really value and appreciate this particular politician. And then she hired me to come work for her. And while I was working for her, she said, Pia, if you want to go in the public sector, because I figured out at that point I need to go in the public sector, she said, you should really finish your degree. So here we are 10 years later, and I finished my degree. I ended up after all of those weird little bits of study, I ended up fleshing it out with some critical thinking, statistics, history, and of course policy and public policy and politics and power, and ended up finishing a degree in political science.
Oh wow, that's kind of crazy. So it kind of spanned like 9 years or like 10 years.
Ended up being about 12. So the first year or two of study ended up not being counted. It was just super annoying. Oh, wow. But it was working for her, and it was doing those studies that made me realize both the opportunity and benefit when a public sector is working well. But it also was the first time in my life that I'd really studied the history of the Australian political system and Australian democracy. And it was studying the history of Australian democracy that got me mad, got me truly frustrated and a bit embarrassed, learning about actual White Australia policy, like how it came about, what it meant in practice, what it did, and just the awfulness even to this day that created. And it was pure populism, Trump well before Trump. Like learning about that made me even more committed to helping ensure that the public sector system, needs to be used and accountable to the general public good and public benefit, not just to populism.
Yeah, that's cool. And how hard was it to sort of pitch yourself to Kate Lundy? You just saw her speech, and I guess at that time when you were in a completely different major, how did you sort of tell her that you really wanted this job? Or was it just
I didn't. No, I didn't go looking for that job. So I mean, when I first went to see that speech, I was still working in the tech sector and still more than happy. And we sort of just kept in touch. I was genuinely impressed by her approach to the portfolio. And a few years later, and I'm still in the sector, was when there was a whole series of public consultations around the future with Kevin Rudd. And so she was like, hey, Pia, how would you like to participate in a looking at the future and future directions from an IT perspective? I'm like, totally. So we collaborated on that. And then soon after that, I moved down to Canberra, to Yass Canberra. I think she's a senator for the ACT. So we were catching up at a bar camp, and she asked me if I knew anyone that would be interested in working. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I would. She's like, oh. So it was really, really cool. It was cool to learn about that system. I hate politics, but I love democracy. So it was good to learn how that system works. Because at the end of the day, I'm still a sysadmin. I started my career as a sysadmin. And now the system that I administer just is the world, right? Or that I contribute to administering. So it's all just big systems thinking now, looking at all of it.
Yeah, that's cool. And what kind of work did you, like, if you were to describe like a day in the life working for Kate, what kind of work did it entail? Was it it was very different to what you were doing, like, because that was pure IT. You were using IT for like a sort of more political field.
I don't think there's such thing as pure IT.
That's kind of true.
So, I mean, because my starting point in IT was tech support, sysadmin, and then later on solutions architect, those kind of things. But for my whole adult life, every job I've had has had some aspect to problem solving and engaging with people to understand and help them solve their problem, right? So tech support, a person says, oh, printer's not working. It's like, okay, well, let's troubleshoot that together. Right through to, designing, a disaster recovery system, right through to, any problem you have involves the problem, the people, the technology, the systems around it, all those kinds of things. So a day in the life for Kate, working for the senator, she's a really hands-on, or she was a really hands-on senator. So the big difference between MP officers and senator officers usually focus on just the work of the Senate, which is the House of Review. So, there's a lot of review of departments, review of proposals, review of new legislation. It's a job very much focused on maintaining the integrity of the political system, of the democratic system. But the senator officers in the ACT and Northern Territory, as territories, and there's only 2 senators in those 2 jurisdictions, tend to work a bit more like an MP's office, where you have people calling you all the time. Citizens, your people in your electorate just need help. People are like, I've got a problem with this, with a visa. I don't know where to go. I've seen something terrible happen. What can I do? Can you help me figure out who to talk to in government? Can you help me get some open data? Like it's literally anything. So a day in the life would involve a lot of that kind of electoral office work, just helping people in the ACT with their concerns, their fears, their hopes, engagement in that way. I kept myself out of the political side of the work because I didn't want to be involved in the political side. I've not joined a party ever, and I don't really want to. So I stayed away from that part of it. But the second part of my job, though, was IT policy advice. So Kate and I worked really closely together on reimagining what participatory governance could look like. We designed and ran a whole series of policy consultations where we'd say, let's, the government's doing a new national cultural policy. So why don't we engage with the tech culture, the gaming sector, the electronic arts, the, new media. Let's engage with that sector because they usually don't get involved in these kinds of consultations because they don't necessarily see themselves as arts quite often, but they are part of that sector. So, we reached out and had thousands of people participate in a co-designed policy approach. Okay, what do you think is the most important thing? What are the top priorities? What do you think would help? What are the problems you're facing? And we collected all that together and then delivered it to the minister responsible for that and the department responsible for the policy development so that it could actually contribute to it. So we did these massive Gov 2.0 consultations and engagements and just reimagined and demonstrated what's possible, plus a whole bunch of internal demonstrations of the use of technology to improve governance, everything from open data and data visualization techniques right through to just helping government officers and ministerial and senator officers to engage in the concept that the public aren't there just to vote for you. They can actually be part of the solution, part of the policy development process. So we did a lot of really cool work like that.
Yeah, that's cool. And so, like, for my audience, a lot of people, they probably are not familiar with the term participatory public governance. Is that kind of like democracy, or how would you kind of explain it?
Sure. So a lot of people assume that democracy, that your participation in democracy as a person, as a citizen or a resident, as a person who can vote, is limited to voting. So quite often when people think about participation in their democracy, one, particularly in a mandatory voting jurisdiction like Australia, so one is voting. Two might be if you've really got the time and inclination to participate in public consultations with the government, which you may or may not be a satisfying experience for a lot of people. And then that's kind of it. Like, people don't really think about engagement. For me, the real way that we can make particularly the public sector, let alone democracy, more values-based, more resilient and adaptive, and more beneficial to people and communities is by actually shifting the operating model so that policies, laws, services, the very operational delivery and governance of the public sector could actually invite the public in. I could actually say, okay, well, and I mean, this has already started in service design. So a lot of the services of government now involves engaging with the actual end users of government services to help ensure that the design and delivery are going to work for people. But I'd love to see us get to a point where we do that same sort of open participatory consultation on policies, on laws, on regulations, like in Taiwan. Taiwan is my favorite jurisdiction for participatory governance because it's not just participatory. They've got this they call it radical transparency approach to governance, which is just extraordinary and well worth looking at. But of course, the biggest problem for the public participating in governance is, and in democracy in this broader sense, is capacity. People are too busy. They're full-time at home, they're full-time at work, right? So I would love to see something like in New Zealand, they used to have citizen juries where they would have, like jury duty, but for policy, where you get a demographically based group of people to actually contribute to areas of major public policy. I'd love to see something like a civic gap year. Imagine if at any point in your life you could opt in to being in a pool where you would get paid for a year of public service, and you could go and contribute to any area of public policy or service or regulation or legislation that you have a care about. Like that would not just provide an opportunity for citizens to contribute their expertise and an experience into public policy, but it would also give a chance for the public service to not get too insular in its work and in its focus. It would dramatically shift the culture and make the public service something that everyone can then have a invested stake in making work for the people. So there's lots of things that we could do to create a more participatory approach to democracy, to governance, and to the public service. But it requires both a understanding of the value of it and addressing the issue of capacity.
Oh, sounds interesting. And so just wondering, because I don't have that much knowledge on the topic, is like the participation, is it like kind of like compulsory for everyone, or is it kind of like a survey, kind of like, oh, you can have your say in it if you want? Or how does it, because you might have one group of people who are really driving it, and then they might give ideas that are not necessarily good for like greater good.
For sure. Well, when we were doing, there's a couple of parts to that. When we were doing the consultations that we were doing, it was a small office running it mostly online, so it automatically had a bit of a bias. But when you do, as part of your consultation, an analysis to the participants, you can say, look, 50% of the participants thought this was a good idea, but 100% of those people actually, oh, look, they work for the same sector or the same demographic or the same company or whatever. So therefore, in order to validate that this is actually a broadly representative idea, here are the people we now need to go and engage with to make sure that it is actually representative. So you can't, and this is where a lot of public consultations fall down. They usually analyze the inputs, but not the context. So you have to analyze the context, not just the input, so that you can say, is this broadly or representative or not? And it means that no consultation is ever then wasted, because even if you only get a subset of the community, you know that you've got a subset of the community, you can go and flesh that out. To mandatory, there will always be people that don't want to participate in anything. So I don't think you could ever make something like this mandatory in the culture or context of Australia, or probably a lot of countries. But one of the beneficial thing is if most Australians had the shared experience of something, then that would help with our general social cohesion. So when I was a kid growing up, there were the same 5 channels or 7 channels on TV for everyone. All the kids watched the same TV shows because, you only had so many options, which means that growing up, most people my age, even if we have nothing else in common, will have certain cultural and shared experiences from growing up, right? That are common. Certain shared points of time, whereas kids or adults or everyone today can literally be side by side in the same classroom, but having a completely different experience because of how we use the internet and the personalization of content and echo chambers online and all these kinds of things. So I think that there's something interesting in trying to figure out what could be, and I'm not saying that my civic gap year is the thing, but what could be some areas of shared experience that we could have. And there are countries that have mechanisms for shared experience, whether it's military service, whether it's public schooling, whether it's a particular rite that everyone goes through. In New Zealand, I would argue that every school and education and even workplace today being grounded in connection to Te Reo Māori and Te Ao Māori cultural practices, provides a grounding. It doesn't matter what culture you're from, you're in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that's the common ground that you can all stand on, right? I think in Australia, it could be connection to country. If everyone acknowledged and felt and engaged with their connection to wherever they are now, what is the history and land and stories of where I'm standing, that could give me both a connection to the country. I mean, I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country right now, in Canberra, but it also gives you a shared experience with everyone else. It's what I mean? Like, we need shared experiences to have social cohesion and to have mutual understanding and empathy with each other.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I'm also wondering, in terms of doing the, getting consultations, getting input, is there how do you sort of figure out when you're gonna cap it? Because to be able to run all that, it costs money, it costs time. And how do you know when you feel like you have enough of the representation?
So it depends on the thing. Sometimes you don't, sometimes the timing, you don't have a choice because there's an external deadline on getting input into a process. And so you just have to make do with best you can. But, and again, just keeping in mind the capacity thing. If you don't have capacity, then it's only going to be the people that happen to know that the consultation is going on, that happen to have the capacity to participate. And of course, you will end up attracting a whole bunch of advocacy and lobbying kind of people who that's their job, to look for those opportunities and to be scouting it out. So designing a proper consultation is takes takes planning, takes understanding who your target audience is, and then going to where they are. So you can't really squish it into a month or two. You really need to plan it over the course of 6 to 9 months. Yeah. Depending on the consultation. Like if you're doing a consultation about, I don't know, fishing regulation, you can't just put an online website. You should be getting posters up in popular fishing spots. You should be going out into fishing shops and asking them to put stuff up or to engage with their members. Going out to the clubs and stuff. You getting government to stop trying to be the mountain and forcing everyone to walk up the mountain, but actually going out to where people are is, I think, part of the paradigm shift that needs to happen.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Yeah, and when you talk about the sort of shared experience, so other than the Australians' connection to the land, have you seen any sort of common values, or are there any other? Yeah, for Australia, kind of keen to know your opinion.
Oh, that's an interesting one. So the Senate, when I worked for the senator, one of her portfolios when they came into government was multiculturalism. And it's interesting because in Australia, whether people explicitly appreciate it as a value or not, I think it is definitely part of the fabric of our society, and I think it's a very positive thing. The notion that whatever your background, we are all Australian, I think is something that most people have as part of their day-to-day. You have people who are neighbours with all different sorts of people, and most people are pretty cool with that. There's a few people out in culture wars and in different sides of politics, but the average person, has friends of different backgrounds, different religions, different ethnicities, different points of view, and we all just get together for a barbecue, right? There might be some halal snags. There might be some, a lack of pork. There might be, there'll be a bunch of vegetarian, and that's kind of just normal. So I think multiculturalism is a really, it's an aspect to the Australian culture and society that I deeply value, and I think it's part of our biggest strengths actually. I think that the tall poppy thing is a pro and a con. I'll tell you a little joke that this is how I explain tall poppy syndrome to people from overseas. So there's a guy at a airport, and he's as a up and coming kind of media guy, and he's a bit of a suit and tie kind of bloke, and he's standing at the airport waiting for a client, and let's say, I don't know, Kerry Packer or Murdoch or someone walks in. He goes up to him. He's like, oh my gosh, it's amazing to meet you. I've always admired your career and everything, and I really have based my career on you, and it's such a privilege to meet you. Oh, thanks, son, whatever. And he says, look, I've huge favor. I completely understand if you can't do it, but I've got some clients coming. Would you mind, as you walk out, just saying, hey, Mike, how you doing? It would mean the world. It'd be such a huge thing. And he's like, oh, okay, all right, I'll think about it. Anyway, so Mike's clients turn up and he's talking to his clients. And the Packer, his plane is called, and he thinks, oh, why not? He was a nice young bloke. And as he walks out, he goes, hey, Mike, how's it doing? And Mike turns around and goes, F off, Kerry, can't you see I'm busy right now?
Oh.
That's Australian culture. Like, there are countries where culturally they worship and put on a pedestal anyone who is successful, however you want to define successful. The thing I like about Australian culture is that no one can be too successful. Like, everyone feels an innate sense of, I could do that too. Just because they can do it, just because they've done something doesn't mean I can't too. Like, that's why I think you get so many Australian innovators. If you go to any major tech company, if you go to any major open source community, you will find a disproportionately high number of Aussies, because we're in a country where we're lucky to have a good education and good access to opportunity for education and skills development, but we also have a internal sense of, oh, I can go and do this. I can solve that. I can get involved. Why not? Give it a go. So yeah. I think that's a really helpful aspect, that we don't get intimidated by success. We actually are inspired by it and get on with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, that didn't really come to my mind at instant. Yeah, cool. And yeah, just wondering if you could maybe explain two other concepts to the audience. So that really, I guess, sort of encapsulate about what you do for work. So maybe Gov as a platform, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then maybe designing a better future.
Sure. Gov as a platform is both a strategy and an ideal. So it starts from the concept that government, and I mean particularly the public sector, but all of it, should and could be a social, economic, potentially cultural, but certainly support mechanism to lift everyone up, a platform that people can stand upon and have equal access to opportunity and to live well, a platform upon which people can thrive. But as a technology approach, it's also about architecture. It's about building modular systems that can actually be mashed up for different value. Building the rules and the data and the technologies that anyone can then build upon, that build out not just public infrastructure but digital public infrastructure to democratize the ability for anyone to create value, the ability for anyone to have a go and be able to get opportunities in the digital world. So that's the short version of Gov as a platform. And examples of Gov as a platform is digital regulation and legislation, service registers, reusable service components, APIs, open data, etc. The second concept, building better futures, I think so often people get caught up in, how do I make things a bit better? A bit faster, a bit, more efficient, a bit this, a bit that. And the problem is that whenever you just iterate the status quo, you're actually reinforcing the status quo. You're at best building on an old paradigm, and it may or may not be the right paradigm, but you're driving a car by just looking in the rear vision mirror. if you don't plan where you want to drive to, if you don't have that light on the hill, then you're not naturally going to get to anywhere better. You're not naturally going to be converging to a future that is optimal or designed or desired. You're going to be just pinballing your way through life, making things, just iterating on the status quo. So designing better futures is about saying, you know what, forget 5 and 10-year strategies because they're always just the status quo and speed. What does 50 years good look like? 100 years, 200 years? What does my optimal quality of life, day in the life look like? How do I want my grandkids to be able to live? And when you start looking longer term future, first of all, your values come out. It's not just about reacting to a new trend or your most immediate pain point. You're actually starting to get to what your values say good life looks like, which will be different for every culture and every person to a degree. But you start to be able to say, okay, as a community now, what does good look like and what does bad look like? And how do we plan towards the good and how do we mitigate against the bad? And that sort of longer term forward planning informed by history. I mean, I have to say it, our Western knowledge systems are not very good at long-term planning, at looking at long-term history and long-term future in order to step at that today. Western knowledge systems are very short-term planning systems, whereas you go into, any number of First Nations and Indigenous knowledge systems that are exceptionally good at long-term planning. And, there's actual departments in New Zealand inspired by Māori knowledge systems to have a 100-year plan. If you go to a bunch of, of countries throughout Southeast Asia or broader Asian governments, they have a long-term plan. I think one of the things that we need to get better at is having a long-term planning as part of our culture, part of our ethos, and realizing that it's not about just reacting to trends. Like rather than trying to predict the future, which no one can do, you should design the future and then walk towards it. And it's only by designing our optimal futures we're going to get there. I guess the other final couple of tips I'd have for your listeners, just things I've learned along the way, are the key areas I think are important to being a ethical, high impact, and genuine in your life are to know yourself. And for me, between my parents and martial arts, that I've had a lot of lucky access to tools to know myself and continuously evolve myself. You will never stop growing. And so learning how to continuously develop and improve yourself and understanding of self is really important. Critical thinking, amazing skill set to help really understand and be able to unpack something. It's no point just feeling uncomfortable about something. You need to understand why you're uncomfortable. Is it because there's something genuinely problematic about it? Or is it because it reminds you of that awful experience you had when you were a kid? Are you interacting with something for what it is, or are you interacting with your own trauma? There's a really interesting difference. And finally, to, again, not just to think about futures, but think about your values. If you can apply your knowledge and expertise through the lens of your own values towards action, there's no point having knowledge without action because you're never going to do anything. There's no point having knowledge plus action without applying your values, because then you might end up doing something the opposite of what you think is the impact you want to have on the world. So always try to be values driven and values based in everything that you do, so that we can actually create a more humane world. It is a very important part. So there's a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, pretty good thoughts. And in terms of values, like how does one, like, was there a certain way that you were able to sort of uncover your values? Or was it?
I think it goes back to knowing yourself, because some of the things that might feel like a value might actually just be habit, for instance. So really getting back to the source of self, it takes time by yourself. It takes time away from distraction. It means actually taking personal and direct responsibility for everything that you do, for every action you take, and for every impact that you have, whether you meant it or not. So I think, and that's quite a scary thing to go through, but it's also extraordinarily liberating when you try, engage with yourself in that way. because your values will come through when you just sit quietly and allow yourself to hear yourself, as it were.
Oh, that's kind of interesting. So to sort of understand your values, you would sort of almost do a sort of meditation on yourself, kind of.
Personally, I find meditation very helpful for this, but also, true meditation is not relaxing. true meditation is unpacking yourself and understanding yourself, and having nowhere to hide from that process. Like, there are definitely types of meditation that are relaxing, but active meditation is a pursuit of self-understanding.
Do you have a specific meditation that you personally practice?
I got a bunch.
What are your top?
My martial arts is really good. Like, if I some meditation for me is very active. One very simple one that I do, which is not about seeking solving a problem or self-awareness, but it's more of a litmus test. It's a really simple one, just sitting quietly and imagining a shape. It might be something a bit more complex, like a chair, or might just be a ball, but in your mind, just holding the picture of it, and then just very, very slowly turning it one way or another, and just doing this. The clearer you can hold that picture, the harder it is to hold that picture and to have it turn slowly and not, jagged or really fast. The harder it is to do that, the more unsettled you are. So you might feel fine, but if you can't do that, then you know that you need to go and do a run, or you need to do some active meditation or some wall watching or something. So or some mantra, or whatever works for you. Like, I have a whole bunch of tools from my kit. Everyone will have a different kit that works for them. So for me, that's a lovely one because it's a litmus test. It's like holding up a mirror to my mind to seeing how I'm tracking. But yeah, the wall watching is a fantastic one. But sometimes just sitting with a question. And the other trick that I've got, which has nothing to do with meditation, but it is helpful, is there will be people that naturally call to you, people that naturally impress you, and you don't know why necessarily. It's not necessarily an intellectual rationalization of it, but people that impress you, learning from, getting guidance from, getting mentoring from those kinds of people is very important. And also building yourself a bit of a what I call a sanity or integrity circle. So there will be people who, and you don't want them to be like just friends, but people that you respect their moral compass. Go to them, say, hey, I've got this problem. I don't, I really respect your perspective. Can I ask you about it? And engage with people and build your network of integrity in a very purposeful way. Because then when you take a step, you can sort of feel confident you've had a bit of peer review of the step, which means you can move fast. Like, you don't want to just become you don't want to accidentally run in the wrong direction. Yeah. So engaging with people to test those steps is really useful. I'm very sorry about the background noise.
Oh yeah, it's fine. Yeah, that's a pretty good tip, to use other people as a reference, especially people that, I guess, where your values align. So
yep. And offer to be that reference for other people too, and practice taking off your biases to help a person take the right step.
Yeah, that's hard. Yeah. What about in terms of critical thinking? Do you have a sort of a toolkit that you personally use to be able to develop it?
Yeah, honestly, it was a one-term topic at university, gave me heaps. Honestly, like, just practicing in there's a whole bunch of excellent critical thinking techniques. Logic deconstruction is really helpful. Being able to, because what's interesting about that is if you take there's a premise, what sits below the premise, what sits below that, what sits below that, until you can break down all the assumptions, and then suddenly you can see, oh, I was uncomfortable with this, but I can tell now that I was only uncomfortable with this because of this premise down here, which is wrong. So now I can go and deal with that. So honestly, any critical thinking subject at a university or online will give you 2 or 3 or 4 tools that you can use immediately.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yeah. Do you think a lot of critical thinking leads to almost a lot of, I guess, self-doubt, because you're always questioning everything that you're doing? Or is there a a point in time where you sort of switch it off?
So because of my martial art, there's not a lot of tolerance for pontificating. You need a more scientific approach, which is, is this the right or wrong thing to do? Give yourself a week, give yourself a day, test it, and then take action. Because if you don't take action on the best available information to you at that point in time, then all of the intellectualizing in the world, doesn't matter how right or wrong you are, you've made no impact. So you have to have a bias for action. And you know what? If your bias for action includes continuous measurement, monitoring, and reflection on the direction the action is taking, you can always rectify and correct an action. But to take no action means you are allowing, something bad to happen, or certainly not contributing to something better happening.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. And just want to go a bit back to your kind of career. So after working for Kate, how did your career shape?
Okay. So after working for Kate, I knew I wanted to work in the public sector. It was working for her that made me realize that if you stand right back and look at the whole system, look at society as a whole, that the public sector has not just the greatest role to play in shaping how we live, but is the greatest, it is the best motivated system for public good. Doesn't mean that it always achieves public good, but it is the best motivated part of the system for that in an accountable and long-term way when it works well. So I knew I wanted to work in government. I knew I wanted to work in all of government. I knew I wanted to work in something tech and Gov 2.0, as it was called then, related. And I knew I wanted to have an impact on the whole system, not just on one thing. So it was quite natural for me to look for work at what was at the time called AGIMO, Australian Government Information Management Office. And I was particularly impressed with the number of people that worked there. And so I found a role that was advertised, an EL2 at the time role, and I went for it. And I was very lucky. I was the best candidate. I got hired. The job that I got from my old boss might listen to this and still finds this very funny. I knew the sort of things I wanted to do, but the job that I actually got was more of an administrative support role for a FAS, for a Band 2. And so and I loved working for that particular person and in that particular team, but I really don't like administration. So I automated about 70% of the reporting that I had to do in the first couple of weeks, and then put my hand out for Data.gov.au, which he kind of knew was coming. So I was able to take over the administration and the policy work for open and big data and for government, and then started with no resources and then built it up over a couple of years. And yeah, that was then one of my key things I was responsible for. So it was really good. So I started at the right place, working with the right people on the areas that I wanted to. And then over subsequent years, the short version is I try to go wherever I can have impact. The Digital Transformation Office was set up 2 years later, and my boss immediately knew that I was like, I really have to be there. He's like, yeah, you do. And so I went over to there for a year, and then I had I got pregnant and wanted to have my baby, and it was the couple of months before my baby was born, or due to be born, that a whole bunch of public data stuff happened. So I said, you know what, for the last couple of months before I go, I'm going to go back to the data agenda so I can help shape that up before I go on maternity leave. I took 9 months maternity leave and had a great time. We spent, my husband and I actually took our little one when she was 6 months old overseas to a tiny little country town in New Zealand to just be a family without any work or distractions for 3 months, just to learn what sort of, and to design what sort of life we wanted to have for our little one. So that was a really special time. And and then the New Zealand government folk that I knew from my day-to-days heard I was in town and invited me to come down and do some work for them. So I basically, went to work for the New Zealand government, went back to the Australian government, went back to the New Zealand government, went to the Canadian government, sort of, because of the work I do around Gov 2.0, around open government, around open data, Gov as a platform, and now regulation and legislation as code, always has a bit of an international interest, and I always treat the world as my workplace. yeah, I've been able to meet and learn from and work with some of the most brilliant people around the world in different public sectors and different places. So I've been quite privileged that way. And my most recent job working with Service Canada was extraordinary. Just such an amazing group of people, such an amazing place to work, and we achieved some really extraordinary things together. So anyway, I'm going to get all mopey. But when I was working for the finance and I was doing Data Gov EU, I could see the opportunity, but I could also see that we could do all the supply in the world, but unless there was demand, it wouldn't really take off.
Yeah.
So in my copious, and at the same time, a whole bunch of hackathons were starting around that time, about 10 years ago. And the hackathons were a mess because companies and departments kept, hiring consultants to come and run hackathons, which were then completely commercial events. So people were, signing NDAs to go in a hackathon, which is just insane. So I could see that my people, the geeks, were kind of disengaging from government because of this awful experience with hackathons. So a bunch of us got together and said, well, why don't we, GovHack had been run a couple of years before as a government funded, but, small community kind of thing by a company. And we said, well, went to the company, said, could we use the name GovHack? They were like, yeah, go for it. So we used the name of the brand and we set up GovHack as a, by hackers for hackers, geek run community event, which has been running ever since. And, that was really cool because not only did it help me, participate in my happy place, which is in voluntary open source community development kind of stuff, but it also, of course, created an annual pulse for open data, which then created demand for departments, and then departments started building into their program and planning to release open data at least once a year. So it was very helpful.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And you also got to sort of marry a bit of your government work with your open data. So it all kind of like fit pretty well together. And also just wondering, you also said you had some, I guess, like pressures, especially being a woman in technology while working. I guess, can you how did you sort of deal with it? And what did it look like? Was it like some people sort of undermining your expertise or?
Look, in every workplace, you're going to have a douche. It's just a given. And I think that sometimes people let that get to them. And so the first thing here is don't let anyone else define your happiness or your life choices. Because, being choosing to not do what you love because of an idiot only hurts you. It doesn't hurt them. They don't care. So I haven't dealt with, I've definitely heard a lot worse stories than what I've dealt with. But to be honest, and some of it hasn't been from men. So I remember going into work for an ISP, and there was a whole bunch of people hired to be in tech support, and then a whole bunch of people hired to be in customer support. Most of the tech support were men, most of the customer support were women. But we were all doing the same, this was for an ISP, but we were all doing the same induction training. And, most of the other tech support, I was in tech support, most of the other tech support people, there were blokes and me, but it was totally fine. There was nothing weird. It didn't feel weird. It was just, a bunch of people getting together to do tech support. But in the lunch break, a little cluster of women came sort of sidling up to me and sort of, said to me, oh, it must be so weird being a woman in, the only girl in tech support. I'm like, it wasn't until just now. And it took me a few years to realize two things. Well, actually, I'll tell you the main thing. It took me a few years to realize that actually I was quite intimidated by other women. I actually went to a conference about, not that long ago, about 8 years ago in New Zealand. It's a great conference called Women Who Get Shit Done. And it was just women. And I felt deeply uncomfortable. And I remember having the space and time and the safety to explore why I felt uncomfortable. And I remember explaining to someone that, a man can, or a male can put you down, can ostracize you, can, be patronizing to you, can whatever, but only a woman can really threaten your femininity and your sense of self as a woman. And I explained this to my group in the Women Who Get Shit Done conference, and they were like, oh, wow. And I, even just going through the process of exploring it made me realize yeah, I've actually been carrying that weight for a couple of decades, and that made me actually quite liberated. So that was kind of cool because I only was probably in my mid-20s before I really got comfortable with my femininity, because I'd been told my whole life that that I was a tomboy or something, somehow less feminine because I was into martial arts, guitar, and computers. I mean, there is nothing masculine about any of those three things.
Yeah.
In fact, there's entire martial arts dedicated to women. The Shaolin nuns were a lot more scary than the Shaolin monks. Yeah, so learning to be comfortable within my own skin took me till my mid-20s, which I think is probably the case for most people, mid-20s, late 20s, before you really get to know yourself. But yeah, that was a really interesting thing to overcome.
Yeah, and just like a little bit more on that. So sort of how did you sort of find another aspect to you that like you're like, oh, this is feminine, or was it like more about redefining what femininity meant to you?
It was a bit of both. I I think the other breakthrough moment was again at that same UN conference when I was in my early 20s. I remember going up to the Malaysia stand because I'd heard that Malaysia had more women in IT. And I said, oh, and they said, oh, yeah, it's I don't know, 60 or 70% women in IT, from the most technical to the most senior, because women do the sciences and men do the arts. I mean, what's it like in your country? And I'm like, oh, and I had this epiphany of it's entirely cultural. There is nothing biological about, who does what. There is nothing to do with our gender about, science or not science or whatever. But Western cultures have this perspective that the science is a man's thing and arts are a women's thing, but there are cultures where it's the opposite, right? So coming out of that and realizing that even though I knew that being female, and I'd never questioned my being, my femininity, I questioned what it meant, what my femininity meant, but that's all right. But even though I knew it wasn't biological, that was the first time I believed it wasn't biological. You know what I mean? Because there was so much subtle pressure to sort of say, "Oh, Pia, you're just the exception that proves the rule." So I felt like a freak for so many years because I went against the public narrative, the general perception that having a scientific or strategic brain was somehow a masculine thing. There's nothing masculine about it. It's a brain. All of our brains are capable of all things, and the general infinite potential inside all of us, we unfortunately allow to be shaped by media and storytelling and people outside of ourselves. So the key thing is to not allow yourself to be shaped by anyone. Shape yourself.
Oh, that is a good one. Yeah. But also kind of curious, have you found any other aspects that you would consider that are feminine for
Oh, look, I
yourself in
mean,
particular?
so here's a really materialistic one. I mean, when I started in IT, I always, and for a lot of my first couple of decades, I dressed I dressed in a more conservative masculine way. I
Yeah.
wore camo pants, I wore shapeless
Yeah.
things, I didn't dress pretty because I felt to do so would invite problems for myself. And I remember again, mid-20s, I was going through this whole gender association crisis for a while. But I remember like seeing someone come into my workplace, a technical workplace, a woman come in that was dressed very, very pretty. And I thought to myself, oh, well, she mustn't be here, mustn't be technical. And I realized I was part of the problem. I realized I had internalized it to that point. So, probably by my late 20s, I was like, was when I'd really got comfortable with reshaping my sense of self and sense of my own femininity. So just something as simple as just dressing pretty, just putting on a dress is something that I love doing now, but I never allowed myself to love doing then. You see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. It's the simple things, right?
Simple little things that I had denied myself from a sense of a false sense of self.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. Just aware of the time, just have like a few quick questions and then we can wrap up. Yeah, just like a fun question. So on LinkedIn, I saw you put Mandarin down as one of the languages you speak. How good is your Mandarin, by the way?
Buha. Jen Buha. It's not very good at all. I learnt it when I went to when I lived in China for a while. I still practice occasionally. put me in a cab and I can have a pretty robust conversation. But as you probably know, Chinese is a funny language because to get a basic competency requires a lot. The reading age for a newspaper is like university level, whereas the reading age for newspapers in Australia is 8-year-old. So it's so I can have a bit of a brawling conversation. My little one, who's only 6, I will ask something. She knows that when I start breaking into Mandarin, that things are really serious. It's like, Abigail, come back, come back, come back, Danisha, and she's like, yeah. So it's very casual now, and I need a lot more practice.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Well, I mean, my Mandarin's quite rusty from living in Australia so long, but I was like, that's pretty cool. I'm also wondering, like, how do you sort of, I don't know, like balance music and martial arts in your life? What does your sort of routine look like for keeping it up?
Oh, unfortunately, it's a bad time to ask me because my life's so upended at this exact point in time.
Yeah.
But look, I try to train a couple of times a week at least. When I'm in a proper routine, I try to train every morning. I try to do a bit of meditation and moving and forms. But even when I'm not as regular, I try to do it at least a couple of times a week, and usually we'll spend some time once a week or once a fortnight with my my shurful, my teacher, and one of my fellow students. Even though we live in completely different places, we get together and exchange knowledge regularly. With the music, it's whenever the mood takes me. I haven't done recording for a few years, but just because I haven't had the time or the studio, but I'd like to get back into recording at some point. But whenever the mood takes me, I get my guitar and I'll just sit down for an hour or so and just play, which I absolutely love. I sing a lot with my daughter. She and I do a lot of singing. Of sometimes just making stuff up, sometimes Tadeo songs, sometimes whatever. We have a bit of a repertoire. And I guess that one of my big lessons has just been to be present with whatever you're doing. Be present. I think a lot of women feel guilty when they're at work that they're not with their kids or family, then guilty when they're at home when they're with their family or friends, but not at work. And the key to happy life is to just be. When you're at work, be at work. When you're at home, be at home. When you're with someone, be with that person. And if you can be present in the moment, you can both enjoy, contribute to, learn from, and evolve through that experience. But you're also not going to have that weight. Can I share just a quick story?
Please. Love to hear.
It's one of my favorite stories that, and my husband and I refer to it all the time. It's not my story. It's a example story. So there's two, let's put it, so there's two Shaolin nuns walking down the road. Let's go with this. And they both belong to a particular order of silence, right? And they're walking down the road, and there's an older nun and a younger nun, and they come to a river, and there's a man crossing the river, yelling out, "Please help me! Please help me!" And his clothes are sort of ripped all over the place, and he's limping. And the older nun springs into action. She runs up and she grabs him, and she sort of helps him across the river. And he says, "You have to hide me. There's terrible people coming behind." And so she hides him behind a bush and stands in front of him like this. And the younger nun doesn't really know what to do, so she just stands next to her. Anyway, a bunch of people on horseback come running past. "Did you see a man? Did you see a man?" She's like, "No." And they kept going. Anyway, and so they wait a moment, and then he says, "Oh, thanks so much." And he goes off in the opposite direction. So the two nuns just keep walking along. And 2 hours later, the younger one says to the older one, "I'm so sorry, but I can't deal with this anymore. Back there, we broke, like you broke, a half a dozen of our rules, of our laws, of our, and you lied, we're nuns. So, how can you rationalize that?" And the older nun just smiled and she said, "Well, I put that man down back at the river. Why haven't you?"
Yeah. Yeah, she's still clinging on to
baggage.
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting. Yeah, I've heard the similar story, but it's from the monk's perspective when he was helping like women cross the river kind of thing.
I changed the
Yeah. And I think, yeah, another question is that like, I guess you would be considered a kind of futurist kind of person. How do you personally stay present while you're sort of like designing the future? Because there's like some sort of kind of conflict.
Not really. When I'm undertaking to do future design, I'm present in that activity.
Yeah,
When
okay,
I'm
fair enough.
when I'm talking to my kid, I'm present in that activity. The purpose, the future. If you live in the future, then you're never truly present, for sure. And I hear what you're saying. But doing design of future isn't about living in the future. It's about taking time out of your life to figure out where you want to go, so that every step, and to have a clear picture of that, and a clear picture of what good looks like for you, so that every step you take in your life is naturally going to converge towards your own personal better future. So and then I just happen to extend that to, trying to do design of organizations or institutions or services or whatever. But in everything you do, be present. Just carve out time in your calendar, in your diary, in your agenda, in your program to imagine where you want to go, to actually design where you want to go. Otherwise, every day you're just going to be running faster and faster and faster, but on a treadmill, not actually getting anywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, whereabouts in China are you from?
Oh, okay. So I was actually born in New Zealand and I came to Australia before I was 1, so I don't remember anything. But my parents are from the Guangdong area, so the
Guangdong.
Cantonese speaking. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Have you been there before?
I have. We lived in so when I lived there, I lived there twice. I lived in Zhengzhou, which is Henan province, but then we traveled all the way down to Guangdong, and down to Xianggang, Hong Kong, and then up to Shanghai, went all the way over to Xi'an, over to Yantai, and just did a whole bunch of backpacking. And then went back and lived in Beijing just for another month or two doing language. But yeah, Guangdong's pretty cool. It's lovely part of the world.
Yeah, great food. And also, do you consider yourself, because like you do martial arts, you also talked about Chan Buddhism, would you consider yourself like almost like half Chinese, or like do you lean towards one culture more than the other?
I used to think that way. And I guess that where I've actually arrived now is um, I draw inspiration wherever inspiration is to be found.
Yeah.
But I don't kind of bind myself by any one thought. I have found there's a lot to be inspired in most cultures. In all cultures, there's something inspiring and something to learn. I learned a lot, not just about Chinese history and cultures, because there's many, and ways of thinking, but it also was a mirror against what I was used to. So it also provided a point of contrast. So by living in a different culture to your own, you get a point of contrast that then helps you better learn who you want to be. And so you're not just living in the in the echo chamber of a particular culture or a particular perspective. So I guess now I've obviously been shaped by a number of cultures, but you need to not just allow yourself to be shaped. You've got to kind of shape yourself. so,
Yeah.
so I wouldn't say I wouldn't be at all saying what's that word, pretending to be one thing or another. But drawing inspiration from different things has been I've been in a very privileged position that I've been able to do that, and feel very humble about that.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Not almost fixing your identity on anything. It's more
Yeah.
liberating to be maybe like a quarter Chinese, like or whatever. Yeah, I have another question, but I don't think you can necessarily answer it. It's why are you so altruistic? Because I feel like a lot of people they have that model where I'm first gonna look after myself. Maybe like the first 30 years or so, I'm gonna accumulate wealth, be financial stable, and then I will start to think about the world and what I can do. But it seems that like from a very early age, you were already doing that. I know you had like some influence from your parents, but do you really kind of know why?
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, it's from a position of privilege. So people that are born into privilege have the luxury of not having to think about just survival. So I try to remain extremely aware of the privilege that I've been born into and lucky enough to experience. And but there are a lot of people, who have it very difficult. And if you need to struggle to get food on the table or struggle to eat, then that, of course, has to be your first priority. That's the first thing. So privilege plays a role in it. And the society that you're born into as well, because some societies look after people to try to create greater equity of opportunity, and some don't. So some people just have to look after themselves and their families. I think the second thing is it goes to culture a little bit as well. There are cultures that think about community first and cultures that think about self first. And you can sort of roll with that for your first couple of decades. Like people will, like, unfortunately, Australia has become a little bit too much about the individual over the community. It used to be more community oriented, and I think it could be more community oriented again. But ultimately, the individual can't succeed if the community is not strong and healthy as well. So I saw that pattern very early on. So trying to contribute to a strong community is the only way that you can actually contribute to an equitable society where individuals can thrive, not just some individuals that happen to have been born into privilege. So I guess it's a sense of fairness, and some communities value that and some don't. And I think finally, how success is defined in different communities is part of this. For some societies, if you're rich, then it must be by merit if you deserved it, and that's a really dangerous and scary philosophy, I think, because lots of people are rich without having done anything to deserve it, and lots of people are poor even though they are worthy of so much more in any respect. Societies do shape a lot of behaviors. I think I believe, and I do genuinely believe, that every individual has this infinite potential within themselves. It's really about whether people get to a point in their life. It can happen in your teenage years, it can happen in your 20s, 30s, 40s, it could happen in your 70s. But people at some point in their life can choose, regardless of their upbringing, regardless of the culture they've been born into, regardless of their privilege, regardless of everything else, to define themselves for themselves. And for a lot of people that deal with hardship, they never get that opportunity because every day is just trying to keep it together. But if you can and get the opportunity to create space and time in your life to shape yourself according to your values, I think you'll find that most people are actually, in their hearts, pretty generous and community minded.
Yeah, that's interesting. Kind of leads on to the next question. So it's just a deep one for fun. Do you, Pia, what do you think the meaning of life is?
42. Of course, I'm going to give a hitchhiker's, answer to that.
Yeah. Oh, that's going to be the third time in a row.
And because I am 42 now, I'm living the year of, the meaning of life, which is pretty cool. I don't believe there is any meaning to life. I believe that meaning, you must define meaning for your life. And because I believe that, it both makes it a bit scary and a bit depressing at times, because but it also is quite empowering, because if the only meaning is the meaning that you create, then actually taking that step to create a meaningful life is is shaped by your values and by your action and by your by the legacy that you leave.
Yeah, that's cool. I guess life has no intrinsic meaning. It's the kind of meaning you sort of put onto it.
Yeah, and it's an opportunity to, in my particular martial art, one of the tenets is the idea of leave no footsteps. What it means, what it kind of means is, at worst, don't make things worse. at best, contribute to more harmony. Now, there's no good or evil in this particular philosophical paradigm. It's about harmony and disharmony, and contributing to more harmony and trying to mitigate disharmony. So yeah.
Yeah, cool. Final two questions. Sorry, Pia, if you won the lottery tomorrow and finances, all that stuff didn't really matter, like how would your life change? What would you do differently?
Nothing. I love what I do. I would probably, if I won $1 million, I'd probably I'd keep doing what I'm doing today, but I would probably what would I do? Oh, I know what I'd do. I'd go and invest it in not invest, it's the wrong word. I'd go and create a organization to build some of the public infrastructure that I want to build.
Just pretty much investing it back into your work.
Pretty much. I love what I do.
Yeah, that's cool. So what is the perfect ideal day in the life for you? What time do you get up? What do you fill it with?
Oh, that's a cool question. That's why we have weeks, not days. Okay, so I guess a perfect day would be getting up at 6 and training for an hour. Seeing the sun come up and probably smashing a punching bag with some power forms. Then waking my little one up with a song, and her waking up not grumpy, and and us having a lovely breakfast together with my husband, and talking about our upcoming day. Taking her off to school, and after dropping her to school, logging on to code up some new legislation, social service legislation as code. And building out some services for people to know what their legal eligibilities are, and seeing the latest 100,000 people be helped from that service. And then finishing, having a nice lunch with my husband somewhere, maybe going for a swim in the pool in the heat of the day, and or going for a run, and then keep going with some cool work, catching up with some cool people, participating maybe in an online conference about social reform, and then finishing work at a reasonable time at like 5 or something, and picking my kid up from an after school thing, and going for a family walk along a beach. There you go.
Oh, sounds beautiful. Yeah, and that's pretty much the end of the interview. I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been quite long as well. And yeah, very inspired by you. I love how you sort of, you're very thoughtful, you're very intentional, and you're very self-aware. So yeah. So
thank you.
Keep up all the great work that you're doing, and hopefully maybe one day we can catch up in person. Yeah.
Absolutely. Look, thank you so much. And I think I really value the chance to have a chat. And it's been lovely meeting you and getting to talk through some of these things. And I really look forward to just seeing more of your podcasts and seeing hopefully people be inspired to be their best selves from these and other talks like them.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Thank you. Let's say bye.
Bye.
Bye.